Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, David. It's one of the reasons that this talk has this name is that when David and I first started working together, I was always flummoxed by how he could turn up at places and make amazing pictures with apparently never having done any photography for the previous 3 months. And whereas I have always labored away needing to repeat myself a lot. And so, in fact, I think even David would concede that actually practice doing it there's no real substitute for that. And fundamentally, that's what this talk is about. Some people need to practice more than others. And I probably count as one of those people who needs to practice a lot. So I'm going to move swiftly into it. And this is the last egotistical picture that you will see here. But I thought it was worth showing for several reasons. Not the least of which is that every single camera in these pictures of me shooting is different. And I thought, oh, this is good. I've managed to show every kind of photographic hiatus I get myself into, including hand holding, until I realized that actually I am indeed on top of a tripod here as well. So there's clearly a kind of theme of preference for being a tripod kind of wielding photographer in general. But I must admit that I do even hand hold the camera from time to time. So everyone here takes pictures, I know, and so that none of these themes is new. But the point I really want to make is that the kind of the paraphernalia of photography is important. Whether we like it or not, we use these instruments and we need to practice them and practice them and practice them. And these technical skills form the basis of craft like any other craft, being able to make cabinets or make sculptures or pots or indeed music. Being able to use the tools of your trade in a way that's coherent and reasonably connected. And then there's more. And this is the other side of photography, if you will. What you could call photographic seeing, and whether we have an intent, a purpose. We all have to deal with aesthetic theory and practice, whether or not we think of it that way. Many of us worry about storytelling, narrative. We feel we need to express ourselves and interpret the world around us. And in that process, we have to analyze what we do. And critical evaluation and feedback, perhaps from our peers and also from ourselves, is a very important part of that process. And these could, roughly speaking, be lumped into this section that I called art and soul. They're not separate from craft, but they are a distinctive aspect of it. All of these skills, I think, require practice, and in many ways, a lot of that is simply repetition. So I'm going to run through just a few examples of how repetition might manifest itself. Sometimes, in my case, it means literally almost copying myself, and that's pure curiosity. Sometimes I'll go back to a location like this one at Padley Gorge in the Derbyshire Peak District, and I can't find a better composition than the one I shot back in the day. So. And it's actually kind of cool to see how, in various ways, things have changed. And then perhaps they haven't changed as much as you might think, given that so many years have passed. These trees haven't actually changed that much in their size and proportion and their relationship. The Querang in Skye, which I'm sure all of you will have been to, one of the most beautiful landscapes, one of the most dramatic landscapes in the UK. Back in 2005 and here just last year, same time of day. I've adopted a very slightly different position, but in many ways the spirit of the picture is quite similar. This sequence of 3 is made at Killiecrankie last autumn and is separated only by a few days. I've repeated the composition because I couldn't make a composition that I preferred from this position, and it's actually quite instructive to see how, in this case of repetition, how only over the course of a couple of weeks the landscape in its kind of delicacy and detail can change so much. Now, all of this practice began for me back in the 1980s as a travel photographer, and I was really lucky I didn't realize it at the time, I just thought I was making a living, but in the late 1980s to get commissions doing travel books. And what that really involved was putting the camera on a tripod and taking it down again, making pictures in the meantime, over and over again, hundreds and hundreds and actually thousands of times. And that repetition was really, really helpful for me. My back yard, as it were, is Rosebery Topping, not too far from here, below or above the village of Great Ayton, where we live. And it's a place that I know and love. And it's not really so much that Rosebery Topping itself matters. It does. It's a focal point in the distance, but the landscape around it that I'm interested in, and using Rosebery as a kind of signature feature of the landscape. But it's not only going to the same places and repeating ideas. It's really about getting to know the landscape and our craft of photography by repetition. And in some ways, it's more than that. It's also about understanding how that translates into the photographs that we see. So what I've done next is to look at how landscapes themselves might be considered. And I wasn't that surprised, but what I discovered when I looked through my archive was that actually the majority of my work probably fell into this category, the intimate landscape. But I also realized that this category is very, very wide. And I'd like to sort of characterize it in many ways as being both creative and also not so creative, if you like. This picture, for example, which is shot in Tasmania, you could easily describe as a flat artwork copy. Where does the art come? It comes from nature itself, and this is the idea behind that kind of work. Whereas other images, this picture is made in the Lake District in June, when David and I were leading a workshop, require a little bit more imagination, a little bit more luck, and also a little bit more timing. One of the things that is critical in intimate landscape photography is the color of light itself. Sometimes the light's very overcast, which lends itself to particular types of image. This is a pond in a parkland landscape in the Midlands, shot for a book on Capability Brown. It's hard to tell where the surface is, and the depths are to a large extent down to the reflections of light. Well, this is in Ascent, and again there's an ambiguity here for me about the space and what we're actually looking at. We're actually looking at water behind this birch branch, but it's the ambiguity that gives it, for me, gives it depth and engagement. Very much as Lizzie was talking about earlier, and Tim in fact. The colour of light is a critical part of our photography, and this is, in the intimate landscape, is an area that it's possible to really explore what that means. This picture for me is interesting on a couple of grounds. One is that it's not that successful from my point of view because it looks staged, even though I don't think it was, and yet it shows two particular types of colour of ambient daylight, but also native colour. The native colour is the leaf itself. The colours that you see on this burnt tree are actually the reflection of the blue sky and the reflection of the world's largest cliff, El Capitan in Yosemite. And this picture was the one that really taught me and consolidated me in my practice the idea of the colour of light and what a critical role it plays for us in our photography, and how it can be harnessed to create depth and mood. The blue from the sky, and the gold from reflections of cliffs just outside the image area. The previous picture actually helped me probably in compositions like this, but this picture has no such complex lighting. It's rather overcast light here, but it brings me into another thought process of intimate photography, which is around how we as humans reference the human body and the gesture and expression of the human body, and indeed of animals, as we look at the world around us. If you look carefully at your own hand, you might see a reference here. Sometimes intimate landscapes reference other landscapes. Quite often pictures made from a very short working distance might appear to have been made from a great height. And sometimes they might reference a fusion of things from the imagination. And one of the great things about ice as a theme is that it's so infinitely changing. So whenever we photograph ice, it's an exciting moment because you know it's not going to last. I returned past this puddle in the track an hour and a half later and there was no ice there. Sometimes the imagination itself is what drives the process almost completely. And here I was just looking to push myself to see if I could use the setting sun and the seaweed together in some interesting way. And I think again it's the gesture or the expression of the human figure that has a reference point here. Now intimate landscapes can take more kind of mundane appearances as well, and woodland is a wonderful theme for many of us in this room, I know. And so I love photographing woodland. Sometimes it has a fairly obvious kind of idea, as here with the mature trees, mainly larch in the background, and the small birch in the foreground. And that youth and relative old age is one that I'm sure that we can all relate to on one level or another. Sometimes it's just purely the magic of the moment. Aspen trees are essentially all related to one another. They all share the same DNA generally in a grove like this, and the thought that this is fundamentally one organism is hard to escape when I look at that picture. But we also see the understory is different trees here, a different type. But it's also the snow and the colour, the simple monochrome values of the light that bring it together. This is actually Avebury, and these are beeches. And for me, these immediately suggest nerve endings of, or maybe a spinal column, or something around those sorts of themes. And I just find it fascinating that trees can imply or suggest so much to us. This is actually back in Padley Gorge again. So it was in February this year. On the face of it, not a very promising time or indeed light to be out in woodland. It's extremely chaotic. It's for me, very exciting to try to make pictures where, on the face of it, it shouldn't be possible to make pictures, because how do you compose such chaotic elements together? And it was wonderful seeing Lizzie's pictures earlier, particularly because I just could relate to the challenges that she sets herself. So, intimate landscapes can also, for me, describe the wider landscape. That's where the emphasis is on, probably more on the foreground, and yet bringing its context to life by including the space beyond it. I always like the idea that you can photograph a mountain and yet make the picture of a blade of grass in the foreground, and that actually in some ways it's the grasses and the decaying matter in the pond here, and the little rocks and roots and so on, which are actually the kind of star of the idea. This picture in particular is one that I like because it was made in the kind of light that I hate, which is blue skies with no clouds, an absolute impossibility in the UK and especially in Scotland, isn't it? Well, maybe it isn't. So, because if there's enough shadow around, it's sometimes possible to combine the virtues of shadow, which mean the preservation of frost and snow, with those areas that now have early morning sunlight where the frost and snow may have burned off, but which has that rich red and orange of the Scottish landscape in the distance. And finally in this series, although this is on the face of it a vista, for me it's the intimate interplay of the lily pads and their serpentine stems in the foreground that make this picture. And I wouldn't have made the picture if it weren't for the lily pads. So here's another possible theme for a landscape, the geographic landscape, and I've just got a few examples of this. And the idea here really is, it's that I'd always like my pictures to express something, but I know an awful lot of the time they don't. So I'm asking myself, well, do they still have a purpose? And I still think they do, and I'm quite interested in the idea of landscape photography as geography, as the record for future generations of now, the here and now. What does the landscape look like? So here we have pictures that are described in a palatable and pleasing way, landscapes at a certain moment in time. They may not be a huge attempt at expression or metaphor, but they do represent the facts as you can see them if you go out into the landscape. And there is a beauty in that as well, although maybe that may be what drove the intent to make the photograph in the first place. But I will readily concede that the primary kind of virtue of these pictures, if they have any, is they provide geographic information. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that. Most of you will recognize these places too. Cornwall a bit further back, the Rumps, and then the last one was Ullswater. This is actually in the Shropshire Hills. Of course, it would be nice if these pictures also in some ways distilled or epitomised those landscapes. This is Land's End. And Dinorwig Quarry, Snowdon in the background. Almost certainly on another workshop with David. So, most of them are. Or Rosebery Topping, a local landscape. And very often, all of these pictures have been shot in the landscape format, and some of them are relatively panoramic, and maybe that's in keeping with the nature of a geographic focus in the landscape. But here we have an exception. This is Australia, the top of Mount Sterling, and I like this picture, but I realise that ultimately its main virtue is to describe this landscape with its granite tors, its burnt out eucalyptus trees in the distance. This white here, this is shot in late summer. And so this is not snow, it's actually where wildfire has run through this landscape about 5 years previously. And that, for me, is part of its geographic interest. The iconic landscape, well, everybody knows Death Valley. And this is Toledo, one of the first places which I photographed, I suppose, with a strong sense of reference, because it's the home of El Greco, the great Greek Spanish painter, who was a revolutionary of the Spanish Renaissance. And he painted Toledo, what became his adopted hometown, from this exact point. So for me, it's an exciting picture to make. But it's because it's iconic that I've included it in this section. Venice, of course, is iconic. But what is it about iconic landscapes? What should we be doing as photographers when we come across places that are extremely familiar, recognizable? The Tuscan landscape, for example. I think it's a great challenge. I think it's an opportunity to try to think differently. Tuscany we always associate with blue skies and sunshine, probably. So this is in overcast and rain. Beachy Head doesn't get much more iconic than that in the English landscape. This picture is not one I'm particularly fond of, but I think it's interesting because of the long exposure, which you'd say, oh, it creates a sort of milky impression. Well, yes, it does, but the reason that the water is that colour is actually the chalk in the water. So if you made a short exposure, it would still be very bright or white and very opaque because of the incredible amount of chalk in the water there. And iconography comes in different forms. This is St Mary's Lighthouse in Northumberland, but it's also a landscape of a lighthouse. Lighthouses themselves are iconic in lots of ways. Bamburgh Castle, as we all know, looks best from the northwest, except this is from the southeast. And Mailifell, Is that the right pronunciation? in Iceland is, to me, epitomizes a volcano. It's a very small volcano, but a volcano nonetheless. And where I was lucky, I guess, to make my own kind of image, something that means something to me here is simply the repetitions in the composition. And then I got lucky with this little cloud, which echoes the shape of the sandbar in the foreground. Ellen Donnan in Scotland is the most photographed icon in Scotland after Edinburgh Castle, by all accounts. So it's quite fun to try to find an alternative viewpoint of it. And the English Lake District is iconographic in its own right. And this particular view, for me, evokes and reminds me of J.M.W. Turner, who is definitely an iconic English painter. This is very much the kind of light he would have liked. Well, what about Yosemite, that most iconic of all global landscapes? Most of us, including me, have made our pictures of it from the gateway to the valley and from tunnel view. But this picture was made from just outside, not the park itself, but outside the valley, where I climbed up a long granite slab high up onto the distance, where I could see both El Capitan and Half Dome in the distance. And it shot at twilight. It wasn't great light, but it was exciting to find such familiar scenes, but from an unfamiliar place. And I like to think of this as the Pride Rock from The Lion King. It isn't, of course, but it is the Drakensberg Amphitheatre, a very amazing and iconic landscape. So the Grand Vista, sometimes pejoratively named by a colleague of mine, is still something that people enjoy photographing and still has a purpose. But due to the fact that it's so popular, I've only included two, and it's really, there's very little difference in some ways between these grand vistas and the geographic landscape. But there was a slight difference in emphasis for me, and I just wanted to mention this possible theme or way of thinking about landscape as another alternative. But here's an area where many of you have definitely worked and enjoyed making photographs, and whether you've thought of it this way or not, I'm not so sure, but the sublime. This is really a 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century concept. And it was a driving force behind painting back then. And in terms of photography, it can best be seen, I guess, as landscapes that are majestic and grand and awe-inspiring, awesome, I believe, as the Americans would describe it. And these are places of great beauty and impressive, but what makes them sublime as opposed to simply picturesque is the conditions. Because what's wrapped up in the notion of the sublime is the threatening, the dangerous, the life endangering. And so for us as photographers, we can sometimes touch on the sublime when we see these mighty landscapes and they're being illuminated by stormlight or particularly challenging weather conditions. And so it's a kind of category which arises out of the conditions that we're in. I think there's a few of you here who were with me when I made this picture in Glencoe a couple of years ago with a snowstorm coming down the glen. And this is on Skye, Scuanastri, pretending to be a volcano. That's literally a cloud burst over them. That was really an unbelievable sight. It only lasted a couple of minutes. Probably of all the sublime landscapes I've been in, I think in many ways this is the most obvious example, because when you walk underneath this 200 or 300 ton boulder, you are in theory putting your life at risk. One of these days it's going to fall, hopefully not on you. And this picture always reminds me of the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark, if any of you remember that scene. And this is from a very recent tour in Greenland, and I think that perhaps of all my experiences of the sublime, this is probably the most visceral. And I should give fellow traveller Nicola credit for this little phone sequence, because she shot this and not me. But I think you'll see why seeing this amazing arched iceberg, a thing of extraordinary beauty and majesty, was also pretty terrifying if you've been in the wrong place. So now you can understand why, when you're out in a zodiac, you should never go too near an iceberg, especially an arched berg. This wave did come towards the ship, and the skipper had to turn the ship towards it to make sure that, basically that everything didn't fly everywhere. It was a very, very interesting experience on all sorts of grounds. So sublime also includes for me extraordinary moments of beauty and kind of power in nature. This is my first glimpse of Antarctica back in 2013. This is South Shetland Islands, seeing snow and glaciers coming down to the sea in the most amazing, extraordinary sunrise. It was fantastic. And here's another example. This is a storm at sunrise over Valley of the Gods in Utah. And here's an example of a picture I'd like to make sublime, but haven't managed to yet. This is on the top of Glytherfach in Snowdonia, Snowdon in the far distance here. And this is called the Temple of, or the Fortress of the Four Winds, I forget now. But I'm sure a few of you have been up there and seen it. And to me, it's the most terrifying thing to look at in the imagination. These sharp, razor-like blades of rock projecting up to the sky. And for that reason, it's majestic and exciting to photograph. And it is truly sublime in that sense. But I just need to get up there when there's a big lightning storm breaking over the top of it, and maybe I'll get my picture there one day. The altered landscape is an area that if you live in the UK, it's a very productive theme, because there's so many, nearly all of our landscape is altered in one way or another, but particularly landscapes altered by industry are fascinating to me. They seem very conflicted. They're often quite ugly, but also they have a kind of beautiful ugliness, and I think that the Redcar Steelworks is a great example of that. This is Iceland, and there's a power station just behind this little ridge here. This is at Krafla, I think, in Mývatn. And this is at Strathconnan in Scotland, and really epitomises how we treat woodland as a resource. It's also kind of fascinating because the birches, as so often, are left, the native trees left by the foresters as kind of almost as sentinels to the past. And the fact that you can see the pylons in the distance perhaps is, it reinforces that sense of a kind of, I don't know, I feel empty when I look at pictures like this, but I think there is a point to making them. A different kind of altered landscape is those altered by our ancestors thousands of years ago. This is Avebury, still amazing to experience today, or Hadrian's Wall. Or the Dales. This viaduct in Dentdale is a absolutely landscape-changing feature, dominates it, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a kind of powerful icon of human occupation of the land. As are these mine buildings in Cornwall. So again, a slightly different theme, but one which I guess that many of us might prefer to be working towards is a metaphoric landscape. This is the sort of landscape where we are seeking more than just the appearance of things, trying to say something, trying to discover something in the way that we frame the view in front of us. For me, this will always be El Capitan slain, which is a very odd concept, but El Capitan, the world's largest granite cliff face, reflected, not shown in the picture, but reflected in the waters of the Merced River, with its heart being speared by a fallen tree, something very weird and strange about it. And Bobenhamner in Svalbard, which is a picture that shot on that first trip that you and I did together back in 2013, I think. Now, yeah, a picture that I love and hate in equal measure, showing the remains of tens of thousands of beluga bones where those beautiful whales were slaughtered en masse by our ancestors. This picture is just a fragment of a stream in the North York Moors near Fallingfoss, but where for me the rocks have, partly as a result of a little bit of deliberate underexposure and contrast increase, have become animated in a way that makes them slightly different to mere rocks. Back in Yosemite, a dogwood rose defying this old tree stump on the left.
Not necessarily make a panorama.
Correct. We'll tell that story later, maybe. Or a picture that I made when I was with David back in 2002 in Skye.
Was that the abortive get up to?
It was,
oh,
yes.
For dawn.
Yes, in the middle of the summer. Yes. But which has always represented for me the idea of hope in darkness. In more ways than one. This picture was made in February of this year, and it's of a Caledonian pine in Glen Affric. And in some ways it's a metaphor of the lone tree, but it's not a lone tree. I've long rather objected to the idea of the lone tree because trees fundamentally thrive together as part of a community. And so here it's a lone tree, and some of the graphic benefits of that are emphasized, but it's also part of the woodland that lies beyond it. And this picture, shot on shores of Loch Marie, long exposure to simplify the water, but also allows the tree to move during exposure, so it has a kind of live, writhing quality to it, which is slightly sinister. And if ever a picture was sinister in the landscape, for me it's this one, which it looks like, for me, the gateway to the underworld, or Mordor or something. It's actually in Australia, on Mount Stirling, and these eucalypts were all burnt by wildfire. Well, this is a perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek metaphor for the round-bouldered preferers among you. That would definitely include myself. It's actually shot on the wonderful island of Egg, looking towards Rum. And although I do hate having the epithet JCB attached to my person, I cannot deny that I have a thing for round boulders.
Was that a euphemism?
Well said. Just recently I've been lucky enough to travel widely, mainly in the polar regions, and so a landscape as habitat is something that's of great interest to me. This is in Greenland, muskox, and I'm increasingly starting to appreciate the wonders of seeing wildlife on location. Now, as a kind of recovering large format photographer, I've never really thought I was the right kind of person to be photographing animals, because usually they've gone long before I've finished setting up the camera. But when you can actually hand hold a camera from a Zodiac and still get quite a sharp photograph, there's something quite exciting and absolutely revealing about seeing animals in their habitat as a very important part of the landscape. And just in case you're wondering where the animal is in this picture, it's here, and that is a kittiwake. And what you're looking at there is an iceberg, and not just an iceberg, but just the lower buttresses of an iceberg in Greenland. Humpback whale in Chukotka in the Russian Far East, and king penguins in South Georgia. And these animals, while they obviously inhabit these landscapes, they also affect it and change it by their presence there. And much of the impression that you have is not just of the penguins, but also of the animals that have been and died, such as the remains of this whale vertebrate in the foreground. And just occasionally you get lucky with the spacing. I promise no Photoshop was used to manipulate the... Absolutely. And sometimes you even see human beings in their habitat. So here's a photographer in his landscape. So I'm going to have to move swiftly on. Landscape of memory. This picture especially is a place I know and love. And David and I have been here many times. But it was Paul Wakefield, actually, who really inspired us both to discover this place and to keep returning. Past to the Goats in Torridon. And so I remember Paul's photograph, as I'm sure David does, and it's part of our kind of own internal iconography. And my own experience of Egg will always be defined by this experience, the very first day of seeing this view on Egg in one of those rare, magical and kind of rather elaborate sunsets that you'll only see once or twice a year. This was for me back in 2003. My memories are very much influenced by my memory of painting as an ex-art history student, including Turner and perhaps Constable even more so. And I always think of Constable, and to a lesser extent of Claude Lorraine and Nicolas Poussin when I look at that picture. And this picture is actually very much informed by my great friend David Ward, whose picture of Wastwater from back in about 1992, I should think, I found really inspiring, and I've always wanted to make a picture that I loved as much as that one of yours. What's really quite pleasing for me about this photograph from Wastwater is that the man himself is actually in the photograph. There he is.
Photobombing again.
Sometimes memory is collective, and the collective thought or idea of the North York Moors is of a heather moorland. And so the heather each summer is such an identifying part of it. And I'll always be going out there. Another type of memory is the memory of the living industrial landscape, the Redcar Steelworks, when it was still alive and still operational. And these figures for me epitomize the sense of Auf Wiedersehen to Redcar. Well, the memory might be my archive. I found this transparency lurking among other transparencies a couple of weeks ago when I was looking through my collection, and I thought it'd be fun to scan it and see how it looked today. Or it could be the memory of photographers past. We probably all think of Ansel Adams, I guess, when we look at this view of El Capitan, but Ansel Adams himself was thinking of Carlton Watkins, who got there before him and made a composition almost identical to this one. I probably also think of Ansel Adams when I look at this picture, because this is one that was a really important moment for me, and it is a homage to his great picture of aspens made in New Mexico, and yet it's very, very different to that. So that was the landscape of memory, but ultimately all attempts to categorize landscape must fail, because all landscapes are to some extent or another probably a fusion of any one of those categories. And so it made me reflect on my own practice, which is, well, to put it politely, restless. Some might say completely chaotic. But I actually just have, to quote Lizzie's point, curiosity for almost every landscape. I just love photographing landscape. It doesn't matter where it is, or in some ways what it is. Just that curiosity continues to drive me. And I do believe that the technical skill and the artistic design considerations, and indeed your intent and philosophy, ultimately cannot be separated. They are all one. And I do believe that the primary idea of practice is simple, that when you are in practice, then your photographic vision becomes instinctive. I'm pretty sure everybody knows that quote, so I won't repeat it. I think Gary Player was usually attributed with it. And actually, in many ways, this picture epitomizes that for me, because I saw this window in the trees last winter, the winter before last. I'd set up my camera carefully on my tripod and just tweaking the frame edges. And this deer then just came and stood very obligingly for me in exactly the right gap. I guess that my personal practice, when I think about it, is really this at the bottom, a search for beauty and to be a voice for nature. I would really be happy if I felt that my pictures could say something for nature itself, that would inspire us to protect it and to care for it and to see ourselves as part of it. And to, again, to refer to a theme that both Lizzie and Tim came to, when we think about composition and mood and so on, I just can't be doing with rules. It's one thing I really believe is that rules of composition, well, they're not really made to be broken, they're more made to be ignored in my view. But of course there is a purpose to them. But for me, these are the things that matter. These are the themes. And not only are they important in photography, but of course they're also vital in all the other arts. I'm just going to, because I'm sure I've gone on far too long, I'm going to run quickly through a few pictures which I hope show connection. For example, relationship, which refer to the figure, the human figure, the fundamental grounding of human aesthetics, which are about mood and atmosphere, relationship, connection. And this picture was made about 10 days ago, and this picture was made about 5 minutes later. So for me, that's one of the interesting ways that photography itself is a transformative process. Just the shape of light, the presence of, or otherwise of sunlight, and how things are transformed in that moment. I did shift the camera slightly, by the way, if anyone's wondering. As another lucky moment, last week, and also last week, so these are from Colorado. And I'm not afraid of complexity. I love complexity, and I see the landscape as very richly complex, and trying to solve the jigsaw puzzle of landscape is part of the joy of it for me. And practice in my home patch continues. This was just shot about 6 weeks ago. And I think what that means by practice is that when you go somewhere completely unfamiliar, like Greenland, you have a framework of understanding. And fundamentally, what it all gets down to is this: does the image have a life? Thank you very much.